Okay, OO.
Watch you first, fine with recording.
Lucy second, also fine with recording.
Okay, closing government.
Daniel speaking first and second. I'm fine with recording.
And closing opposition.
Shane first, he, him, please. I'm fine with being recorded. Rob second, he, him. I'm fine with being recorded.
Okay, and let's check with my wing again. Can you, Anel, are you here? I'll give them like a minute to answer. If they won't, we'll just start the round. I'll text the A team to let them know that we don't know if our wing is here or not, and then we shall start. Okay, because of time issues, we shall start the debate. So without further ado, I'd like to call the Prime Minister to open this debate. Here.
Okay, am I audible? Can you hear me clearly? Okay, do I have to say that I will take POIs verbally and not in the chat, if that's anything? Okay. Give me one moment. Okay. To open this debate, our first claim would be that there will be no significant change because of misplacement of funds. So why this is true? First of all, why do we have these misplacements of funds or money not reaching the correct places and what we want them to do? First of all, money doesn't necessarily go to the most effective or useful project. This means, for example, that the EU doesn't research nuclear energy despite the fact that it can be a very clean source of energy. The second of all is the lack of efficiency. This looks like funding institutions to renovate themselves in a climate-friendly way. Now, why this will always happen, and we strongly emphasize this point. First of all is the lobbying by corporations of sustainable energy. Those corporations don't care about the environment. You may think that, but the thing is they care about making profit. So what this looks like is them having a front to say that, oh, we are sustainable and we care about the environment. That means that the research done is to fund the sustainable energy is widely discontinued in those, for example, companies. The second thing is the virtue signaling. The EU can delay to find the better thing to subsidize, the one thing that it is supposed to subsidize that will actually make change, because the thing is that the EU, to an average citizen like me, would seem like it doesn't do nothing. They're not helping the problem, they're making it worse. So what does the EU do? They are actively subsidizing, constantly making changes that might lead to something better, but not always. It's just like gambling. And yes, now what is the second reason why you have why the misplacement of funds and money, they're not reaching the right places? Those countries misplace funds from subsidies, and why this is very hard to control. The EU is not strong on itself. It does not it can be anything without those other corporations or other organizations helping. Those countries, for example, those countries are not internal checked. You don't have people visiting those countries and say, oh, let us check, let us do what is our job to do. And third of all, they don't have the effect of, for example, controlling police or other organizations inside the country. The EU doesn't have this qualification to do so. So why this is important? Essentially, we are achieving nothing. Instead of actually making change, what we do is we strengthen the development of countries entering the EU, and we strengthen the fact of how the EU looks instead of actually targeting the main problem. So instead of actually allocating funds to the correct place, what we do is say, oh, we are the good guys. But the thing is, we're not doing anything to help. Any POIs?
Yeah, it's not just the government giving, the EU giving these governments funds. It's also enforcing regulation to make sure that companies can't act in harmful ways. But not only it helps the environment as a whole, but also the environment in those countries specifically.
Oh, can you rephrase? I'm sorry, you were lagging. I'm sorry to make this inconvenient.
So the EU also often enforces regulations, which forces these countries to change behaviors, and also the companies within those countries to change their behaviors, which helps not only the whole environment, but also the environment of that country itself.
Okay. Sure, you have sure. So obviously the actor is the EU, and obviously there will be regulations in those countries that actually help and for example help, for example, in those countries. But the thing is that those EU countries are not necessarily going to abide by those laws. They're doing it enough to abide to those laws, so they don't seem that they're going against the EU, but they actually don't have they actually don't have what it is. Sorry, they actually will do anything to be, for example, the center of that country, the center of this country. So the link in that EU should use the funding in a way that benefits this union. However, the country will do, for example, with those funding, anything that they want them to do, instead, for example, funding their own country and not necessarily giving the money to the right to the right reason. Thank you.
Sorry, very
We
quickly. Sorry.
Yes.
Did Anel ever join this room?
No.
Okay.
She did, but she didn't respond, and I see now that she left.
Okay, thank you.
Great. We thank the Prime Minister for the speech, and to continue this debate, we'd like to call the Leader of Opposition. Here.
Can you guys hear me okay? Great. No, that's The EU stands on the precipice of one of its most important global choices. Is it going to choose to be a leader going forward in providing solutions to climate change, or is it going to fall behind unless the rest of the world take foot? We're going to review two important claims. Firstly, that the Green New Deal leads to a stronger and more integrated European Union, and secondly, why it empowers the EU's weakest nations. I want to give two important pieces of framing before that. The first one is that most nations within the EU are broadly on board with the Green New Deal. Why is that true? Firstly, oftentimes, the EU has been subsidizing accessing things like cheaper energy. This is due things like solar panels that can be cheaper and subsidized by the EU and help these countries to implement them into their grids. Note that green energy is cheaper per unit relative to oil, but oil is only able to get ahead because of subsidies. The only reason why countries don't implement it is because of high upfront costs that the EU is able to help with. And these things get cheaper over time. There's economies of scale of you dividing high upfront costs across a larger number of units, which spreads those costs and decreases them. There's innovations within these sectors that reduce those costs overall, which is able to help these things out. And note why this is important for these countries. Energy costs are rising as the war in Ukraine progresses. There's more demand for the non-Russian oil and gas. This prices out the Hungarian consumers, making it more expensive for them to heat their homes. That is what makes things challenging for them. That is why they're on board with these kinds of things, as well as for the variety of reasons I'm going to illustrate later. Secondly, why does a lot of this investment reach the right places? The EU has extensive experience to reach the right places with their investments. They've rooted out deep corruption and funding of EU projects in former Soviet states like Poland and Estonia. They have accountability checks. They withhold funding when they've detected corruption, and they've built out these kinds of things before. We've clearly been building same gauge rails over Europe. It's clearly not true that opening government claims that these things will be lost along the way. The opening government challenge to this is that companies don't care about the environment. They only care about profit. Clearly, there's only a problem here if there's a trade-off. We're going to tell you that they can make lots of profit, but that is a unique opportunity that exists at this moment that will disappear if we don't take it now. First argument, then, that the Green New Deal leads to a stronger and more integrated EU. Why does the EU care about this? The EU's biggest challenge is having its members sniped. To have nations like Hungary risk funding Russia's war machine, and so they aren't able to take a strong stance against them. To have these things weakening and having the bloc crumble beneath them. This is the kind of thing that is able to be avoided as a result of being able to use the Green New Deal as an axis of strength. Three ways this happens. Firstly, energy security. Many nations have been afflicted by the Russia-Ukraine war and so face supply crises where it comes to their energy. That is that they don't have enough access to cheap fuel, and so that means that energy prices increase within their countries. The subsidization of green energy enables you to have a way out of this, an independent energy grid that doesn't rely on other countries. You can cross-apply this all over the EU as well. Maybe some places don't have a lot of access to wind power, but you can transport the high wind places and get their energy and put it over to places that don't have as much access to green energy and are cross-subsidized model. Why is that a good thing? In the immediate short term, many nations are afflicted by these costs. It is the most important thing for your voters that you're able to heat your homes. It is the most important thing for businesses to be able to reduce their manufacturing costs. This is what's able to keep them afloat, keep them voting pro-EU, and keep their support. Secondly, in the long term, it means the EU is safer. You can't be held to leverage by adverse nations like Russia, like they were before the Ukraine war, where they couldn't put in sanctions because it would hurt them as well when most of Germany's grid depends on Russian oil. It means that you can put in sanctions against perverse nations and you can protect yourself more. You can have more leverage to protect nations protect places like the EU by threatening Russia more extensively. All of the power to protect yourself is greater when you're not reliant on the world's oil giants to fund your power grids. Secondly, trade security. We renew the competitiveness of many places through green subsidies that are happening in this deal. Greece has a burgeoning tech sector of green subsidies, carbon offsetting companies, recycled silicon manufacturing. A lot of these new businesses have been starting up increasingly that have been able to take these countries, which are mostly relying on things like tourism or don't have competitive manufacturing sectors because the euro is an expensive currency, and is able to make them competitive again. You're uniquely competitive here as the EU because this money that the EU has compared to other nations, because you have rich countries like Germany able to fund these things, means that you can be a first mover. You can get ahead of other nations so you get the customers first. You can make the cheapest and most accepted product. You can get crucial supply links. Why does that matter? These nations are in a vulnerable trade position. Manufacturing has been exiting the EU, making a lot of nations within the EU like Estonia weak. They feel hurt by the euro being too expensive, which risks their competitiveness. This makes them uniquely strong. They rely on these subsidies for it to happen. and abandoning it to them would make these nations uniquely uncompetitive. Thirdly, bloc cogency. Firstly, I would note that Germany and France, etc., want to fund these projects with politically and ideologically. Politically, because they don't want China to get ahead. China getting ahead would be economically bad because BYD is exporting cheap green cars already. Chinese firms are making cheap solar panels. Germany and France know that if China gets ahead, this makes them less competitive in trade when Renault and Volkswagen can't sell as many green cars and BYD has already taken over you. But there's also security risks. When the EU nations buy solar panels from Tongwei Solar, it risks hurting them and means that security risks keep in, just like they did with Huawei. Your data being stolen, your interference in your politics, lobbying. These risks are very tangible, and Germany and France are risk averse and want to preemptively prevent these things from creeping in. So they need there to be a strong sector developing, which relies on there being able to be the number of markets that you access through the EU's Green Deal. Secondly, they want to lead the charge on climate change. They know that other countries will follow suit based off of what they do. France and Germany gain unique importance of their influence in terms of crafting these regulations that are ported all over the world, in being leaders in green tech and green investment and leaders of this new world. The end conclusion of this is that the Green New Deal empowers making the bloc more secure. It stops your rivals from holding a gun to your head. It stops the weakest nations from turning to China and Russia for support, and it keeps you relevant and powerful into the future. Does closing have anything? No. Second point, this empowers the weakest nations within the EU. These nations are the most important because they're the most likely to be challenged and sniped out, the most vulnerable to an appealing Chinese deal, and the kinds of things that risk undermining the cogency of the bloc. Why is this important for them? Firstly, you attract green global investment. This makes a lot of these countries the cheapest places for investment in the world that have such robust green market infrastructure, like strong environmental reporting and regulation, or burgeoning green startups with the low labor costs, because across the EU, there's a variety of nations with different labor costs, and some of them are lower than others. So there's unique axes for the cheapest nations to be able to get an advantage here. Poland has a large number of tech companies getting these EU subsidies, and so they're able to attract a lot of investment, which they otherwise wouldn't be able to, uniquely giving them political power and investment. Secondly, it's essential agriculture support. A lot of these nations depend on the EU's agriculture subsidies in order for them to survive, and the climate is being affected by this. The droughts and heat waves are heating them and making it such that EU agriculture gets screwed. So they lobby to support these kinds of regulations because they depend on the important innovations that result from this. Weather-resistant crops, more efficient irrigation, these things that crops survive more into the future, where you're able to have more dangers with your environmental supply chains, and you're able to keep these things safer and keep more crops being exported. Finally, why is this globally important? Solving climate change is just a good thing, right? Even incremental gains matter. Air quality improves in cities with electric cars, meaning that less people die of respiratory conditions. More weather-resistant crops mean that more people are fed as droughts hit the planet. More recycled materials means that we pollute less and make the planet less warm, meaning fewer people die as a result of extreme weather conditions. But secondly, many companies get away with abuses for too long within the EU. These regulations crack down on things like polluting of water supplies and stuff like that, and it's able to mean that these dangers decrease into the future. The EU is at an important precipice and should make the right decision going forward. Vote OO.
Thank you very much to the Leader of Opposition. And to continue this debate, I'd like to call the DPM. Yoo-hoo.
So, before I move on to rebattling and framing and weighing what both of these opening teams have said until now, let's first talk about the framing that 001 first brings about why most countries will be pro-reforms anyway. They essentially say subsidies mean that devices are cheaper, so country probably supports it in the first place. Three things here. First of all, I'm not sure why, as the average voter in the country, when I have a traditional source, very traditional one, that looks like, I don't know, oil, I would prioritize a sustainable source of energy that is more expensive than that, but it is cheaper than it used to be in the past. I think that the average person probably still would prefer the cheaper alternative. Second of all, they assume that the country and the interests of the country align with the interests of the voter, the average person, even if the average person was somewhat happy with sustainable energy that is also a bit cheaper now. Probably politicians are still their own individuals that act on their own ways. They still get lobbied by oil companies and generally all companies that use non-sustainable ways and pollute the environment in their process of production anyway. So they still have an incentive to oppose these reforms. And third of all, people are irrational beings, even if we assume that with these subsidies, I am indeed better off. I do not know why these people will be able to perceive that they are better off, especially when there is so much propaganda about climate change not existing. That can be reinforced by the fact that people don't like to feel like they're responsible for a global disaster, don't like to feel like they are the ones destroying the environment, so they're vulnerable in believing narratives that they are not responsible, nothing is going on. Right. Then they say there are corruption mechanisms, there is accountability. Yes, we concede that to an extent. There are ways to mitigate corruption, there are ways to mitigate misallocation of funds. But we say to you, first of all, you do not know what goes on under the carpet between politicians, between corporations, because there are countries in the EU that do not abide with a lot of regulations when it comes to many different things. Such as humanitarian issues, such as environmental issues, and it is inherently very hard to control these countries because exactly, first of all, there are clear limitations on EU's power. Like, you do not want to be seen as a federal union because you know that this is likely to scare many countries away and make them become even more Euroscepticism. So you do not want to be seen intervening very heavily. But second of all, you do not have like EU envoys going around and checking. You do not know, even if a country has actually imposed the regulations, what your average supermarket in the corner and the average consumer that lives in the country does. Right. Then they say two things. First of all, let's first talk about their second argument, because the thing with the second argument about empowering smaller countries and effectively combating climate change and all the impacts bringing in the end about how climate change is bad, sure, I'm not sure how this is linked with the act. Then there is their first argument about how this strengthens the EU internally, because when you create cheaper, more sustainable solutions, you essentially ensure that countries in the EU wouldn't just trade with China and Russia. First of all, I am not sure why these countries would be able to trade with China and Russia, even if they wanted to, because their products were cheaper in something, because exactly there are sanctions, there are embargo, there are things imposed by governments. These are likely to happen anyway, even if there were no environmental subsidies, because of like political things that have to do with political power, right? There are a lot of people demanding for sanctions and that stuff because they dislike dictatorships a lot. It is even easier to like sensationalize news about dictatorships in Russia and China committing bad stuff in the media because we have no information about what's going on there because of lack of transparency. Second of all, I am unsure why these cheaper products like sell-off would be something that happens from China and Russia and not like from another global power like the US. Third of all, we are not sure why these people would turn like to these sustainable products made by China and Russia anyway, and would not just turn to like traditional products that are still being made around the world because of how powerful companies are. By the way, this is bad when it comes to environment. Obviously, turning to traditional products is something that is bad when we talk about like in the scope of the environment, but when we talk about it from the scope of the EU, that is the actor in this motion, we're not sure why would care about. We were not sure about why we would care about that. And third of all, we say to you, if you want to be competitive with China and Russia, if you want to be able to combat them in a level of like international politics, what do you need to do? You need to allocate funds in the places where it will be more efficient for you as a power and for you as a union. Because even if this money that the EU gives is somewhat effective, let's say that we concede that, right? Even if it was somewhat effective, it achieved some environmental goals. We are still not sure on why it would strengthen the union so much, right? Probably, maybe it would look a little better, but we say to you the countries that care the most about climate change are the ones like next to big seas or the Arctic, countries that are perhaps not even part of the Union in the first place. And we say to you that the most important goals of the unions when it comes to their goal geopolitically is like increasing things such as their army, their internal strength, perhaps even like allocating money in developmental products that have to do with developing aid in like the Balkans or other areas of Eastern Europe, so that they make sure that more countries join the European Union in the first place. That is more unlikely to happen under Rob because first of all, they're likely to allocate a lot of this money into these Green Deal projects, because from the moment that you start the project, you need to be actively relocating a lot of money there. Otherwise, you just gain the reputation of being a hypocrite and an elitist that does nothing. And second of all, yeah, okay.
Thank you very much to the DPM. We remind everyone that it is required by the manual to take a POI. And to continue this debate, I'd like to call the Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
Yeah, give me just 2 seconds. I'm gonna... I'm going to talk about 2 things. First, I'm going to talk about that the implementation is going to be done well and why there's a broad support for the policy in the EU. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the range of benefits that we are getting dealing with the responses that we got from opening government. The first thing I want to talk about is to respond to some of their implementation challenges. The first thing that they say is that it will be better to be funding other things. For example, it will be better to have something like nuclear energy. The first response I want to note is that some countries in the EU already do nuclear energy. But secondly, opening government never explained to you why on the comparative, they would be funding nuclear energy. There is broad public opposition, in fact, much bigger to nuclear energy because of fears like nuclear waste and nuclear accident. Maybe those are unfounded, but it's true that the vast majority of the EU citizens are quite afraid of that under status quo. The second thing they say is just that we should be putting other subsidies. The first thing is like, I would note that we still do that. The EU has a quite large budget. But the second thing, and very importantly, this is crucial, is that loads of those subsidies, in order to be actually functional, you need to be able to first make sure that the climate is being adhered to. For example, the EU is giving loads of agricultural subsidies, but the problem is that those subsidies become quite useless at the point when the EU is struggling with the impacts on climate change on agriculture, when like crops harvesting are being hurt by heat waves and similar things. So we need to be able to do this in order to be able to have all the other subsidies being efficient. The second thing they say is that there are companies that are lobbying. The first thing, if they are correct, and the EU is so captured by some like magical large companies, why wouldn't the EU budget be allocated better on their side? That makes no sense. But the second thing, I just want to contest to what extent this is true. The EU obviously has lots of institutions where countries are voting. You have the European Council that has the heads of state. You have the Council of the European Union, when you have, in this case, the representatives of like the ministries of environment, ministries of agriculture, all the other included sectors. I just want you to gut check this. You don't have any large lobbying sustainable company that is going to be not just be able to pay off 1, not just 2, but like 27 heads of state. No company is able to do that. Obviously, the EU countries are able to vote and be represented adequately on this. This has several implications. The first, it explains why we are obviously allocating loads of subsidies with those countries in mind, because they have democratic vote in crafting how this policy is done. But secondly, obviously, the EU does not want to have loads of backlash, and which is why they would not want to be actively like misallocating all of those funds, because then no one would like it. Then you would have broad opposition. So obviously there is a clear incentive to be implementing it well. That covers the challenges with opening government on that. Secondly, I want to talk about why there is a broad support for the EGD. The first thing that we noted is that this technology is in fact cheaper because it saves money over time and therefore countries want it. Opening government here doesn't understand. It's not just that it's gotten cheaper. The operation of something like solar panels or wind farms or any other green source of technology is cheaper already than operating coal or operating other fossil fuel. The reason why it is more expensive is because of the upfront costs. It doesn't cost you much to be operating solar panels, but it does cost you a lot of money to build them in the first place. And this is where the policy comes in, because the European Union gives countries money to be able to do all the upfront costs, to subsidize it, but then it saves them money because the operation of those is much cheaper. This is the first reason why countries want it, and opening government doesn't understand it. The second thing I just want to note is that they don't let them to lie to you that the Europeans really like coal. Like coal pollutes. People feel the consequences of climate change. We also have a lot of talk in the media about climate change. Like we're not like the crazy US when everyone is denying the climate. In fact, the vast majority of all stations in the EU are supportive of this. Secondly, we also have green parties often being kingmakers, right? Most European countries have proportional representation. This is a system that you're probably familiar with Israel. So lots of the times, green parties, the small parties that like everyone kind of is willing to cooperate with because they're not ideological beyond green interests, they are often kingmakers who influence a lot about how these countries actually vote within the EU. Thirdly, we have a lot of agricultural lobby, right? Like the average income voter knows that there's a lot of agricultural subsidies coming in the EU. Agriculture is hugely hit by the climate, right? Crops and harvests, all of that gets affected when climate is changing. So this is why, again, loads of countries have interest into promoting this. Thirdly, countries want to reduce dependency. Here, like, they don't understand, OG again misunderstands. We don't say we want to trade more with Russia. We said we want to just trade less with Russia. Because all countries like Hungary, even those most pro-Russian countries, they don't want Russia because Russia is like the war in Ukraine is causing energy prices to be higher. Russia is unpredictable. We also don't like Russia, as they say. So we want to be reducing the dependency on Russian oil. Countries support it. And finally, people in all countries feel the heat waves. We often don't have air conditioning, right? We're used to not having heat waves in summer. Now, like even village people in like rural Eastern Europe feel the fact that they are boiling in their homes. This is the reason why we have broad support. Before I talk about the takeaway from this, does closing have anything? Okay, I asked. At the end of this argument, I want you to have this takeaway. The first, we explain why this will be implemented well. Second, we explain why there is broad support. So any argument about Euroscepticism coming from later is preempted because we explain why the broad society and broadly all governments support it. Even if some groups are unhappy, maybe closing points some of them out, I would also know they can't do anything because the benefits of the EU, like free movement and other subsidies, are so large. This also explains why no one is leaving and countries still want to join. This also underpins all benefits. If closing adds some additional benefits of this, the implementation and the support is the thing that is going to be dependent on. Finally, what are the benefits for the EU? Very trivially, it reduces the impacts of climate change that the EU is already feeling through subsidies, but also through things like regulations. Heat waves, more floodings, all of that affects EU agriculture, EU manufacturing, all of that gets affected through climate change. Secondly, we explained competitiveness gets better because the EU and especially the poorest countries are dependent on manufacturing that is currently not competing well. Now with green subsidies, with the ability to develop better green sectors, these countries become much more competitive. Against China, we didn't say we want to trade war with China as OG misunderstands. We say we want to be able to compete with them because China invests loads in green technology. So Europe needs to be able to do that too in order to be able to compete with China on the global stage. We also explained why you improve the EU internationally. This is a great idea. Abandoning it would be horrible. Please vote opening off.
Thank you very much to the DLO. And to continue this debate and open the second half, I'd like to call the member of government. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. So, for PYs, please don't interrupt me. I'll be looking in the chat. So, starting in 3, 2, 1. A very important clarification in this debate is what countries are we talking about? We from CG believe that developed countries already have pretty sustainable and eco-friendly ways of operating. They have the economy to sustain and to subsidize those specific green green energy things, and to subsidize the industries to become more green. And they also want the reputation of being eco-friendly, of not harming the environment, etc. Thus, we believe that Western countries, developed countries from the EU, already have pretty eco-friendly economies, thus we're not talking about them. Thus, what are the nations, what are the countries that are left out? The Balkans, the Eastern European countries, etc. And the very important thing about them is that they're extremely poor. They have very big economic problems. They can't develop their economies a lot in the status quo, etc. Thus, leading me to the second point here, which is why, even if the funding is placed correctly, there's still a very big problem on two levels. First one, on an economic level, several problems here. There will be taxes on fuels. In Bulgaria, for example, we have a pretty big economic problem lately. Thus, taxing us more on fossil fuels will intuitively lead to less money that are going to be used for developing the economy, for subsidizing businesses, for developing new industries, etc. What this means is that intuitively there is going to be some money that are placed in different areas, in different sectors, which will be the green ones, and not for improving the economy of our country. But second point here is that changing whole industries that are dependent on petrol and oil will be extremely bad for the economy. Like, it is intuitive that fossil fuels and such things are used a lot in businesses, for machines, for vehicles, chemicals, etc., for the production of every single thing. Thus, every single business is dependent on those things, meaning that when there's higher upfront costs for those businesses, it means that there will be less money that they can contribute with to the economy, which means that intuitively there are more economic problems. Instead of investing to develop their business, to make it bigger, to generate more income for the country, they're going to use them for becoming more eco-friendly. Thus, intuitively, it will harm the economy a lot more. Third point, Owo also said that the investment for the country is just to start being a bit more eco-friendly is very high at the start, meaning that when we in Bulgaria, for example, combine elections for entirely different things because of the lack of money, this high upfront, I'll take the POI later, this high upfront investment is going to be extremely bad for us. It will literally ruin the whole economy when those countries, the Eastern countries, the poorer ones, literally have no way to sustain themselves right now, especially after COVID. There are extremely big problems in the economy right now. And fourth point here, why the EU can't subsidize enough and can't give a lot of money to those specific countries. Firstly, those countries have been developing their way of operating for hundreds of years. Like, what the EU wants is for 20 years to change absolutely everything, absolutely every business, absolutely every way of gaining electricity, which have been developed for hundreds of years for the existence of the country. But the idea is that Western nations are already kind of stigmatizing against less developed nations in the EU. What is the idea? Like, for example, when an Eastern person goes to Germany, they're being accused of stealing all their funds, all the European money, etc. Which means that countries like Germany, France, etc., can't give enough money for subsidizing this eco-friendly way for those countries, simply because if they give a lot of money, they're just going to lose a lot of reputation, a lot of support in their country. Most likely, they're going to not get re-elected later. Thus, they aren't going to give a lot of money for this specific thing. I'll get a POI from OO.
Yeah, so the EU doesn't bulldoze your factories immediately. It's obviously gradual, but there are other sources of energy are cheaper. The EU subsidizes your upfront costs. This is great for Bulgaria. You're less dependent on Russian oil. You have cheaper production. You become more competitive against other countries because of this.
It's actually a pretty interesting point. After Russia invaded Ukraine, no country in the EU is dependent on Russian oil because of the sanctions. Simply, this point doesn't work at all. But also, just when they can't subsidize every single thing, it intuitively means that the economy will worsen in at least some sort of way, which is leading me to my second level here, which is Euroscepticism. I know that OO engaged with this. They said green parties will help and advocate, etc. In Eastern Europe, there are mainly Eurosceptic parties or parties that are constantly changing. There are no green parties because those countries are only focused on improving the economy. And what is the idea here? Slight problems in the economy will make people swing towards Russia and China. OO said that it is very important for European countries to not go towards Russia, China, etc. Those countries have had in the past or have in the status quo at least some dependency on Russia, meaning that they're like swing countries. A bit more of Euroscepticism will make them lean a lot more towards Russia, towards China, etc. And they'll be seen as the EU will be seen as a bad actor. They're forcing changes on those countries which are economically not very developed. People have the perception that the EU is a very bad actor and just wants to look good to other countries and doesn't care about those poor nations, forcing them to change absolutely everything about them. And why does the EU care about those 2 points, the Euroscepticism and the economy one? They're simply, first, those countries are interconnected. Worse economies in the Eastern countries mean that also they, for example, can't trade a lot with the more developed nations, etc. Thus, intuitively, the EU doesn't want that. And also, second point, the EU wants influence. The alternative is Russia. I believe OO explained that pretty well, meaning that when those poor nations lean towards Russia, it is very bad for the EU. And lastly, they lose international reputation simply because when those poor countries lean towards Russia, Russia is seen as a better actor than the EU, making also other countries more likely to do that. And on a very important point here is that on our side of the house, the EU can still subsidize these countries and make them more eco-friendly, but it will only happen when they're ready and when it won't affect their economy in any sort of way. Vote closing government.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the member of government, and to continue this debate, I'd like to call the member of opposition. Here.
Cool, just checking that I'm audible. Well, 2 seconds. Oh, I'm going to be recording my speech to send it to my debate coach. Is there anybody that is not okay with, like, mostly on Gov side because they'd be offering POIs? Anybody not okay with being recorded for that reason? Speak now or forever hold your peace. Okay, awesome.
I'd probably prefer to do this more actively, so like to have opt-in. So like, can the members from opening government just say they're okay with the POIs probably being recorded?
Yeah, I'm okay.
Yeah, and Isabella
Yes.
and CG swing.
Yes.
Cool.
I think the problem with opening opposition, they just kind of point to benefits. They say, here's how things could get better as a result of this deal. The thing that OO are missing is that their abandoning of this deal actively creates harms for the EU that are very, very hard to overcome and create a much bigger impact in terms of this debate. So we're going to be focusing on 2 things from closing opposition. Firstly, the skepticism and backlash that would result from abandoning this deal that makes the EU significantly harder to function. Secondly, when it's the only way to get climate action, furthering the comparative of OO's point on this. First, the rebuttal, though, to opening government. They say, you misallocate funds because countries can't be trusted, blah, blah, blah. A couple of responses to this. Firstly, oftentimes funding is centrally planned. That is, you don't just give a ton of money to individual countries and let companies or whoever in them allocate it however they want. Countries and companies or people apply to the EU for funding for specific projects, for specific pieces of R&D or technology, and that is given to them and then monitored and reported back to by the EU. So it is centrally planned in a way that allows for the EU to monitor what is going on with that research and development, whether or not those funds are being used correctly. Secondly, the EU just does have a lot of power and oversight in relation to countries. Like, it is literally, I think they sign up to give a lot of like funding towards, but also like are legally binded to. So like directives and regulations the EU sets, you literally have to follow, or you get reprimanded, like have to get fined, things like that, right? So it just is something that you do have to obey when they say, here is the law, follow it, right? But the last thing is that oftentimes, even if you do misallocate, like even in terms of misallocating funding, even if you buy out of that, a lot of the time these things, as Rob points out in the POI, aren't things that actually you apply for funding for. So like a tax that you are told to set is not something that you need to be funded, because it's just a thing that you then collect, right? And it's monitorable whether or not you have collected it. When you make a new law that says like you have to be working on like phasing out cars by non-electric cars by whatever, it's very clear to see whether or not you've done those kinds of things. So it's just not true to say that you're not able to monitor these things get misallocated all the time. Then CG says, like these countries get screwed over financially. I would say the EU has massive total financial power, and so is capable of like making up some of the losses that it would be able to recognize its poorer countries are going to go through as a result of this policy. So for example, the EU subsidizes poorer nations literally all the time by like building infrastructure in those areas, providing growth or like development subsidies to those areas to be able to like account for the losses or like the potential harms the EU brings to them by like, you know, having richer countries in its area. I don't know why it couldn't just give more of that, especially when a country is collecting like a tax or being subsidized. But also, I think there is scope for allowances or exceptions. Like it's not always going to, it's never black and white with the EU of like everyone has to do all of the same things all of the time, because there is a recognition of the fact that countries are at different developmental and like financial standpoints to be able to do different things. It's why France and Germany contribute a lot more money to the EU, because they have a lot more money. So I just don't know why it would be like black and white and everybody would just be screwed over. It just doesn't make sense for the EU to want to do that. Like presumably they're smart enough people to not want to do that. Skepticism and backlash then. There's a massive sunk cost to this policy already. Firstly, economically, because they have had to put in a lot of funding and investing into the projects that we're talking about, into the research and development, all that kind of stuff. Second, politically, you have to get agreement on this to be able to pass it in the first place. That means you need to get a majority, or you need to get it not vetoed by anybody and also get it passed by votes, right? That means that's like a lot of campaigning, a lot of lobbying, a lot of being able to actually convince people of this policy's merits. The third thing is reputation, right? You've shown like publicly that you've had a commitment to those groups of people. And therefore, so you've committed to this policy, and now you're going back on it. Why is that a harm? Firstly, because it's likely to be there's likely to be significant backlash against it, because you're seen to be abandoning your position after there's been significant investment from those areas, right? That looks like climate activists being like, "What are you doing?" But it also looks like Eurosceptics being like, "This body has forced you to invest a ton of money into this area and is now just saying like, never mind, and leaving you to like with nothing, essentially, because they've abandoned this." That means that it's more likely that you are seen as ineffective or to be a drain of money, because you are actively forcing countries to contribute resources and then not actually doing anything with them and abandoning projects very shortly after. This means that it's significantly more likely to make the EU harder to function, because it's more likely then that people are willing to listen to Eurosceptic politicians, vote them into places like the European Parliament, the elections for which are coming up very, very shortly, and therefore making it significantly more harder for the EU to function, because within those discussions, within policy agreements, you just have so many more dissenting voices, or voices that are actively looking to be disruptive as opposed to like actually try and help people out. It looks like countries like Hungary that are already quite Eurosceptic more likely to veto more policies just as an act of protest, simply because they have just entirely lost faith in the process of the EU, because they've abandoned something they promised will be good. It means the policy is significantly more slower, and you see the EU as a more divided front. And the impact of this is that the EU functions worse overall because it makes all discussions, all policy getting passed significantly more difficult. But this is also a vicious cycle because when the EU is seen to be less effective because of this, it makes Eurosceptic narratives significantly more easier to get pushed through because when the EU is being ineffective, it proves the point of Eurosceptics that they are being ineffective, therefore making people more likely to buy into those kinds of things. Why is it the only way to get climate action then? Because say this is going to be good because it will help the climate happen, but they also say there's broad support for this Green Deal. So it's unclear why countries, irrespective of this deal, wouldn't also want to take climate action if it's a policy that's been so favorable. What's the comparative? The comparative is that climate change is a global problem that often creates a free rider problem. Because when emissions are global, when one country's actions to reduce climate change will also affect all other countries by reducing the amount of emissions in the atmosphere and therefore mitigating damage of climate change to all countries, it means countries have an incentive to not contribute to solving that problem. Why? I forgot to take a POI. None were offered. So that means that countries are significantly more incentivized to not invest in climate change mitigation because of the fact that if they can just rely on other countries to do it, and any other country doing it also benefits them. That's why the Paris Agreement and Kyoto Protocol are largely just not being followed by countries because there's no legally binding agreement that forces them to actually take climate action, and therefore they can all just pretend, or they can all just choose not to do it and just benefit off the countries that are doing it. The EU is one of the few organizations that can actually bind multiple countries into this directive and into actually taking climate actions, meaning it's one of the few actual organizations that can force countries to not take part in this free rider problem and actually take climate action. That means that when the EU doesn't do it, it's significantly more likely that individual countries will still opt not to, because lobbying, as OG talked about, is significantly easier for individual countries, or because there's just an opportunity cost of investing in literally anything else. The impact of that is that it's significantly harder to solve climate change because less countries are likely to do it, but even where they do it, it's likely to be worse because they have less funding, it's more disjointed. For all those reasons, so proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. And to summarize government side of this debate, I'd like to call the government web.
I'm audible, right? Okay, thanks. Again, POIs, please write in the chat. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. First, a bit of engagement towards opening opposition. Firstly, they say that those countries are energy dependent on Russia and China, and this is the way of making them less dependent. I already said that after the war in Ukraine, the EU literally made regulations so that no European country should get any Russian oil, any Russian energy, etc. This point doesn't stand, but also those countries have other sources to buy energy from. Like, for example, Bulgaria has bought a lot of US oil. Thus, simply right now in the status quo, they're not as dependent on Russia and China, meaning on Russian and Chinese energy, meaning that their point does not stand. But also, how simply what OO say and what their case is dependent on is that firstly, this subsidizing will work. Secondly, that Euroscepticism will not be existing, and those poor countries will stay in the EU and follow their guide, etc., and trust them. And third thing, that very big investments are going to exist and to go to those poor nations. From CG, we tackled every single point. We explained why it is very unlikely for those policies to work, even if there is subsidizing. Those countries, those poor countries, will still need to invest at least a bit of money, meaning that it is going to harm their economy in a very big sort of way. Thus, probably going to make them pull them out of those, of this deal. About the Euroscepticism, we explained how, firstly, Eurosceptic parties are very powerful in those specific Eastern nations, and why even slight problems will give those Eurosceptic parties a lot of power, thus influencing the people in those Eastern countries a lot. And about the third one, big investments from those poorer nations, which is also in engagement to CEO's point about the EU already subsidizing those countries, etc. Simply, we explained why big investments cannot exist from countries, from developed countries, because already people in those countries, as Germany, France, etc., have the perception that Eastern nations are stealing all of their funds and that they're not living the greatest lives because of them. Giving them a lot more money means that the party which wants to be re-elected intuitively will not have as much of support, meaning that they do not want to make those investments bigger in any sort of way. Now, when we beat them, when their case is dependent on those 3 points, simply Euroscepticism will exist. Those nations, those investments, you have absolutely no effect in those poorer countries, meaning that their case is not existent. But simply why we beat them on their burdens, they say that going to Russia is bad. We explained why Euroscepticism will exist more, thus beating them on their burden, they will lean towards Russia more. They have big economic problems, meaning that they're more likely to take the big easy loans from China, etc. And lastly, when the economy, when the eco ways of obtaining energy fail, the only alternative is gaining is obtaining energy, oil, fossil fuels, etc., from actors such as China and Russia, who have absolutely no limitations on those things. We beat OO on those 2 points, on those points. Now, to closing opposition, they said that the EU already gives a lot of money to those Eastern countries. Why they can't give more? I explained that, but also about the current investments. If they want to make the investments in sustainable energy bigger, they're most likely going to need to cut the financing on those industries, on this infrastructure that right now exists. Thus, when they're giving a lot less funds to other areas, again, Eurosceptic parties are more likely to use that as a weapon, that they're not funding the important things as infrastructure, healthcare, etc. Thus, again, their point can't work. But they also said that they will look bad if they pull out of the deal, etc. First, the EU will be portrayed as a very good actor because it is listening to poorer countries. It does care about them, etc. But when we are not sure how the EU will be portrayed, but we are sure that at least there's going to be at least some impact on the economy of those poorer countries. When Eurosceptics are pretty powerful, our point beats there. We beat them on their burden, meaning that we also go above causing opposition. I'll take a POI from opening.
7% of Russian oil still goes to the EU. Don't let closing government lie. We noted a plethora of reasons why all countries, including Bulgaria, support this, because it helps them transition from expensive oil. CEO is dependent on those reasons when claiming that's why countries will be angry if it ended. If they don't support it, CGS way, but if they do support it, as we say, CEO is dependent on that analysis.
The idea here is that simply you also said that there's big upfront cost of those for the sustainable energy, etc. There will be fossil fuel taxes, etc., and that the countries are going to need to invest also from their economies towards this sustainable way of obtaining energy, meaning that in every way possible they're going to be affected economically wise. But now, moving on to opening government, how we beat them, simply their case is why there will be misplacement, and why, because of this misplacement of funds, it simply won't work and won't have any effect. The idea here is that we are very unsure whether the EU is going to monitor this, is going to control this money, whether the countries in the EU are going to misplace this money when they're currently getting investments from the EU, and most probably they want to continue getting investments, thus they're going to use them in a good way. Thus, when we are very unsure, and when it was tackled a lot by other teams, whether those funds will go to the right place or not, it means that intuitively their case is very unsure. About our case, it works even if there's a very small amount of economic problems. Like it works even if there are no long-term effects. It works simply when there are even small economic problems, which are going to give a lot more power to those Eurosceptic parties, etc. Thus, when our case is a lot more likely to work, we also beat OG, we take this debate vote closing government.
Thank you very much to the government whip, and to summarize opposition side and this debate as a whole, I'd like to call the opposition whip.
Hello. I'm going to do the same thing as Shane, if that's okay. Everyone can opt into me recording my speech.
So once again, opening government, are you okay with your POIs being recorded?
Yes.
Okay. Isabella?
Oh, yes, yes.
Oh, and CG?
Yes.
Great.
Cool. POIs in the chat, please. Right. First, we're going to respond to some of the arguments that came out of closing government, and then I'm going to move on to kind of areas clash in relation to who it is gets the most like impact in the debate. But first, on the idea that countries will move towards China and Russia if this Green Deal is implemented. I just don't think that this is true for a number of reasons. The first one is that if you're already in the EU, then you're already invested in the like European project, which likely means that you have a number of trade deals that already occur between you and other European partners. You likely have individuals who have to go to the European Parliament and interact with other members of the European Parliament from other countries, and you likely have political ties to those other countries, meaning that trying to broker a new deal with another larger organization, which you have little sway and which you have little way to actually like leverage any power over them, is something that's like unlikely going to be successful for you. And so hedging your bets and encouraging yourself to engage in democratic process with an organization that allows you to have a vote, allows you to have a veto, is probably just going to be more likely. But it's also just the case that it would be like economically, like it would be like suicide to try and engage with China or Russia as opposed to the EU, particularly if you were within the Eurozone, given you are connected to, your currency is connected to other countries within Europe, and so it is within your benefit to ensure that you're operating in the same sort of manner as them. I think that the nature of the EU is that you have to give in order to get. And because of that, it becomes very difficult for EU countries to try and turn on their partners in this way. If they do, they suffer sanctions, they suffer reprimand, and it means that just economically and politically they're harmful. This is why a lot of the time there is some Euroscepticism, because there is the idea that you don't have as much autonomy. But I think that what gives people an even greater idea of having a lack of autonomy is the idea that the EU can implement changes, such as forcing you to put in certain regulations, right? What cars you can drive, what type of energy you can use, giving you money in order to implement infrastructure, and then you implement that infrastructure, and that is part of a large project which is estimated to take a large amount of time, meaning that you have spent a lot of time investing in it, meaning that you have likely planned what it is that your future cities are going to look like around it. You've planned your education, your healthcare to look like something that caters to these types of investments, given that a lot of time these new environmental investments necessitate different forms of like energy grids, they necessitate different forms of buildings than ones that would have been traditionally run on oil. I think what makes them more Eurosceptic is when they've started to implement this type of project and then have to go back on this project and without the support of actively implementing the rest of that project being completed. I think that what this means is that countries are then left with the remains of what the project was when it started, without any capacity to actually finish that project, given that they are unlikely then to receive subsidies from the EU in order to complete a project that the EU no longer supports, i.e. the European Green Deal. I think that this is greatly harmful, and we think that this actively flips the idea of Euroscepticism on the government side. Because what we're able to say is that when you are unable to exit the European Green Deal in a way that is going to be beneficial for those poorer countries, i.e. there's already been a lot of political willpower being put into it, there's already been a lot of economic there's been a lot of like financial aid being put into it. When you now are no longer following through on that, now these countries have no capacity to actively take advantage of the advancements that have already been made. We think that on the comparative, when you're able to continue with the European Green Deal, although it might cost these countries like money in order to implement this Green Deal, we think that they are still going to be able to see those projects be completed, and they're going to see ancillary effects that are going to be beneficial for them. For example, these countries are likely going to be able to see that their water quality is better, resulting in less harmful health effects. Their air quality is going to be better, which results in things such as lung cancer going down. So the type of health effects that close and government talk about that might be harmed because of investment in this Green Deal is actually benefited in the long term, because now the environmental effects that occur because of people's use of fossil fuels no longer happens as much. And so it is a preventative measure rather than dealing with the issue in and of itself. We think that this is like a very large impact in the debate, because the EU then is able to firstly avoid Euroscepticism that would have come about because of the impacts of that, meaning that they are better able to pass policy within the European Parliament in order to get more policy through and get more things done. But it also just increases the ability for these countries in the long term to buy into the European project, because now they say that there are better effects that come from buying into these projects, even if they do have to happen in a long-term capacity. We think the long term is likely just going to be the most important thing in this debate, mostly because the EU probably has money enough to support itself until the long term. The long-term sustainability of the EU is currently under question because of the questions surrounding what countries are going to look like in 50, 60 years with the increase of immigration, with the increase of climate change. So securing the future past that rather than right now is something that the EU ought to prioritize. Before I move on, does anyone have a point? No. Okay. What then do we think? Why then do we think that this implementation is the best bet? Because we think that it protects against a negative effect, and this is the weighing that we're going to do over all of other teams. So while other teams are trying to point out positive impacts that can come about from the Green Deal, we are pointing out that there is a negative harm that we are actively avoiding by ensuring that we follow through on the deal that we have actively made. This negative effect would be far more harmful and keeps things on a neutral level rather than trying to chase a positive effect that may or may not happen. We think that because we are able to prove that the harmful effects that occur due to people abandoning these deals and abandoning the projects that have already happened, we're able to prove that negative effect, and therefore we're able to access the highest impact in the debate. What then is the second impact? And I think this is something that is independent of all other teams, particularly our opening, which is the idea that the EU is exclusively able to enact these types of policies, given they have multiple different countries that cover multiple different industries, that cover multiple different sectors, that have trade deals with other areas of the world through like former colonies and things like that, meaning that the EU is incredibly influential in the type of actions that it takes. When you no longer have the political willpower to enter into green deals because you've spent all of that political willpower on a project that now no longer is feasible, that you now no longer want to follow through on, then it becomes more difficult for countries to engage in environmental sort of concerns. What Shane said surrounding the free rider effect, it becomes harder for countries themselves to make a stand, meaning that they're then unable to actively helm it. That's why CO wins.
Thank you very much to the opposition whip and to everyone in this debate. I'm going to now take the 15 to 20 minutes time of panel, and I will call you back. So please, actually, it's only me, so you can stay in the room, and I'll just unmute myself when I'm ready.